Here we have types of measurement. It is our module 8, part 2. And this is one of my favorite topics because in ABA, data is so important. It helps us to determine what is the next step as well as whether your intervention is effective or not. If your intervention is effective, then what do we need to continue the intervention? Or if the intervention is not effective, then do you terminate your interventions? And at the same time, we want to see what is the effect of our intervention on the behavior. So in module 8, part 2, we are going to talk about three things, okay, which is why is data so important, and measuring dimensions as well as define behavior operationally. I prepare pictures here to talk about the relationship between ABA and data. So I have been mentioning that data is so important in ABA. Okay, it is not only in ABA. Okay, it is in indeed in any interventions that we are implementing that we intend to use for our children or our student. So in the pathway in the journey, okay, or the types of autism interventions includes, okay, applied behavior analysis, which is ABA. Okay, beside ABA, okay, there are so many more interventions, okay, that are proposed for autism. Okay, beside ABA, we also have speech therapy. Okay, then we have occupational therapy, OT. Then we have biomed and sensory integrations, gluten-free, casein-free diet, sunrise, okay, all these interventions, okay, for that are available for autism. So now put yourself in the shoes of the parents of these children, okay? If you're looking for an intervention, how do you know which intervention or which therapy suits the child the best? We all have different learning method. We all have different way that is most suitable and most effective for us. So out of so many interventions, how do we know which one is suitable for the child? This is why data is important to show when we are doing certain intervention, is the interventions effective or not? So the importance of data in ABA is to make sure that we are optimizing the effectiveness of the interventions. What does it mean optimizing the effectiveness of the intervention? If from an intervention you are able to see, okay, and determine and identify the factors when the child is not progressing, once you capture the factors, you make changes based on the data. That's the time that you are able to optimize the effectiveness of the intervention. And that's the time that you can help your student, your child, to actually catch up with all the milestones quickly. And again, data is important because based on all this data, we can make sure and that we are using the evidence-based intervention. Okay, when we talk about evidence-based intervention, okay, that means, okay, while we are doing certain or while we are implementing certain intervention, we need to make sure this intervention, okay, has been found to be effective for a certain behavior. So when we are doing and implementing an intervention, okay, we look at the data to see, okay, whether yes, okay, based on the data that we collected, okay, the intervention is effective. Otherwise, we shall use, okay, intervention from other research and other past studies that has been found to be effective. Thirdly, data help practitioners to answer questions confidently. Again, in our field, in our practice, we want to make sure that we are making a change. We want to make sure that the student is actually gaining and learning from a certain interventions. So if you are asked, okay, whether your child or your student is actually learning, whether their behavior is actually increasing or reducing as planned, then your data will be able to help you to answer these questions. Okay, based on certain graph or based on the collected data, you will be able to see whether the behavior of interest, okay, is reducing as planned or is increasing as planned. And it is to meet ethical standard. Okay, again, okay, in ABA practice, okay, it's really crucial that you need to make sure that you are doing your best, okay, you are providing the most effective intervention for the child. Again, one internet intervention cannot suit all children. And this is why while you're implementing one intervention, you have to make sure that that particular intervention is effective for that particular child. And this is why in ABA, we have all our plan individualized, okay? And this is what we call individualized education plan, okay? Again, in order to make no harm, okay, in our practice, okay, make no harm, it doesn't mean that you are causing physical harm, but instead, okay, if you are not providing and you're not competent in providing a certain intervention, you are actually making harm. If you are not you are not using, okay, the most effective intervention for the child so that the child is able to catch up with the milestone, again, you may also be causing harm. So data is also helping us to meet the ethical standard. Then we have identified and end the use of ineffective interventions. Okay, so beside optimizing the effectiveness of the intervention, we also want to make sure that our interventions, okay, that we are using, okay, is actually making a change in the child's life. Is actually promoting independence in the child's life. If the intervention is not doing that, if the intervention is not meeting our goal, okay, then we may have to terminate or end the use of that particular intervention if that is the case. Then we have decreased loss of precious time and disappointment. Again, in our work, in our practice, it's really important to help the child to catch up with their milestone, to gain as much skills as possible when they are learning. So if using all this data, you are able to determine and you are able to identify whether that particular intervention is going to help the child to catch up, okay, in his or her milestone, to reduce the loss of precious time. Again, time is important, okay, in our practice, okay, especially when we are teaching the child, okay, to meet a certain criteria. So here we have all the importance of data, okay. Again, okay, in ABA, data plays a very significant role, okay, and this is why this module is really important for you to see, okay, while you are collecting all this data, are you using the most appropriate measurements, okay, in collecting your data. In the previous module, we have talked about program development. Okay, while we are talking about program development, we talk about selecting target behavior. How do we select target behavior? And when we are selecting target behavior, we have to make sure that that target behaviors that are socially significant. Then we have also learned about how to define the target behavior after you have selected a particular target behavior. So defining target behavior is really crucial, okay, in ABA to make sure that your team or other therapists, other professionals, okay, are all focusing, are all doing the same thing, implementing the same intervention, okay, on and in order to modify a certain target behavior. Okay, so this is why we need to define the target behavior of interest clearly, okay, and effectively. After program development, we have implementations. While we are implementing the programs, we have to make sure that that particular program is, the child is actually making progress in that particular program. How do we make sure that the child is actually making progress in that particular program? And this is why we have to start collecting data. And this is why we have to start evaluating the child progress, identifying the measuring dimensions, okay, of the behavior of interest, okay, is very important to make sure that while we are implementing and running that particular program with the child is actually making a change in the child's life. Okay, and this is why, okay, after talking about selecting target behaviors, defining target behaviors, here we have, okay, to identify the measuring dimension before we choose the most suitable measurement. In measurement, we have two types of measurements. The first type of measurement is continuous or direct measurement. Continuous measurement measures the dimensional quantity of a behavior. So when we are measuring a behavior, we are actually measuring the dimensional quantity. So for example, we are measuring the count, how many times, okay? Or we are measuring the time, the durations, okay? How long does a behavior occur, does a behavior last? The second types of measurement that we have, okay, in ABA is discontinuous or indirect measurement. In this continuous measurement, we use that to measure occurrences or non-occurrences of a behavior. So instead of measuring the dimensional quantity of a behavior, we are actually measuring whether the behavior is occurring or not occurring. So it's just purely and simply whether the behavior is occurring or not, okay? And we are not measuring any of the quantity of that particular behavior, okay, using these continuous measurements, okay? So in these two types of measurements, which are continuous and discontinuous measurement, we also have a lot of many types of measuring dimensions, okay, under these two types of measurement. In continuous measurement, we have frequency or count, we have rate, we have acceleration, we have duration, we have latency, as well as inter-response time. These six types of dimensions, okay, are part of the continuous measurements. So that means when we are using these measurements in collecting data, we are actually collecting data directly on the dimensional quantity of the behavior of interest. However, in this continuous measurement, we have percentage, we have trials to criterion, we have time sampling, and we have planned activity check. These four types of measurement, we are actually measuring the occurrences and non-occurrences of a behavior. So it is very different from the dimensional quantity that we are measuring from a behavior using the continuous measurements. Okay, in this continuous measurement, we are actually measuring whether the behavior is occurring or not. And for these three types in continuous measurement, okay, frequency, rate, and celebrations, we call that particular measuring dimension as event recording. So firstly, we will talk about event recording. In event recording, again, okay, in this measuring dimension, we have frequency or count, we have rate, and we have celebrations. So let's talk about the first one, frequency or count. Frequency or count refers to the number of responses. So how many times did the behavior occur? So we are talking about the frequency, we are talking about how many times, okay, the number of the behavior. For example, we may have 4 hitting behaviors. So the hitting behavior occurs for 4 times. 4 times is the quantity of the occurrence of the behavior that has occurred. So how many times? It is 4 times. So 4 times is the number of responses. I'm going to show you, okay, and illustrations of frequency or count. And you can see from here, okay, we have 4 square, okay, that came above the line, okay. So we have 1, we have 2, we have 3, and we have 4, okay. And then here, okay, is the time, okay. So the whole period of time lasts for 30 minutes. During these 30 minutes, okay, we have response 1, we have response 2, we have response 3, and we have response 4. We have 4 responses, okay? And you can see from here, okay, in these 4 responses, okay, the length of this, the duration of each response, okay, can be different, okay? However, when we are talking about the frequency, okay, while we are referring to the number of responses, how many responses do we have from these illustrations, okay? We have 1, we have 2, we have 3, and we have 4. Okay, now you may wonder, okay, what is S and what is L? Okay, later on we will talk about the S and the L, but briefly, I'm going to explain what exactly is S. S is the stimulus. Okay, so this is the presentation of stimulus. Okay, and when the stimulus is presented, okay, the behavior occur, and we have response 2 here. Okay, the time in between the presentations of stimulus and the response, okay, we call that latency, response latency, which is also something that we are going to talk about after we talk about the event recording. Okay, but now, okay, for frequency or count, okay, and you have to focus on how many times, okay, did the behavior occur. So again, here we have 1, 2, 3, 4. Usually we use frequency or count to measure the behavior, okay, with digital counter. This is digital counter, or we have counter, okay. We have tally counter. Sometimes, okay, in the old days, okay, we may also use paper clips, or even nowadays, we may also use tally marks, okay, to count the number of responses. All right. So these are the equipments or devices that we may use, okay, in measuring a behavior using frequency or count. So we have talked about frequency or count. What about rate? What exactly is rate? Okay, rate refers to the number of responses per unit of time. Okay, so just now we talked about 4 responses. We have response 1, response 2, response 3, and response 4. What's the difference between frequency or count and rate? Okay, now the difference between rate and frequency is that beside number of responses, okay, we also have unit of time. So for example, just now we mentioned about 4 hitting behaviors. Okay, now in rate, okay, beside 4 hitting behaviors, which is the frequency of behavior, we also have 30 minutes. Okay, so if we say 4 hitting behaviors in 30 minutes, okay, so 4 hitting behaviors occurred during the 30 minutes, we call that rate. Okay, so rate, again, rate involve the time. So we talk about rate involving the time. I'm going to, rate is actually a combination between the count and the duration of the session. Okay, what does it mean? So here you can see 4. 4 is the count, which is the frequency of the number of responses or the frequency of the behavior. Okay, then here we have the unit of time, which is 30 minutes. So again, rate is the combination of frequency and unit of time. So the number of responses per unit of time. Then the last measurement in event recording is acceleration. Acceleration is even more complex than rate. It refers to the changes of response rate over time. So response rate, again, response rate is number of responses per unit of time. Now, in acceleration, it is response rate over time. Okay, so which is usually indicates accelerations or decelerations. If we say the response rate accelerates over time, that means it increases over time. When we say decelerate, that means the response rate decreases over time. Just now, rate can be shown by frequency per unit of time. And now, in acceleration, it is shown by frequency per unit of time per unit of time. So we have 2 per unit of time in acceleration. Okay, it is no longer just the number of responses per unit of time, because the number of responses per unit of time, it is rate in acceleration, which is response rate over time. It is represented by frequency per unit of time per unit of time. So for example, we have been talking about 4 hitting behaviors. 4 hitting behaviors is for the number of responses, 4, okay? And in, okay, 30 minutes. In 30 minutes means the rate. So now, when we talk about the same behavior, but we want to talk about it in acceleration, how do we do it in acceleration? So when there was 4 hitting behaviors in 30 minutes on Monday and 6 hitting behaviors in 20 minutes on Tuesday, okay, now what do we have? We have 4 and we have 6, okay, 4 and 6 hitting behaviors, okay, 4 hitting behaviors on Monday and 6 hitting behavior on Tuesday. These are the count. These are the frequency of responses. Then we have 30 minutes. 30 minutes is the duration. Okay, and we have 20 minutes. Okay, 20 minutes is also a unit of time. So 20 minutes and 30 minutes, they are both unit of time. The first unit of time. Okay, so when we have count and unit of time, this is our response rate. This is rate. However, in acceleration, we can see the first occurrence is on Monday, and the second occurrence is on Tuesday. Monday and Tuesday, they are also unit of time. So now we have count, 4 hitting behaviors and 6 hitting behaviors. We have the first unit of time, 30 minutes, and then 20 minutes. We have the second unit of time on Monday and on Tuesday. So when we say response rate over time, that means on Monday, the response rate is 4 hitting behaviors in 30 minutes. On Tuesday, the response rate, okay, is 6 hitting behaviors in 20 minutes. So we have 2 response rate over time, okay? There is a change, okay, from Monday and Tuesday. So this is what we call acceleration. This is a graph that is used to record the data for acceleration. Okay, we call this standard acceleration chart, SCC. Okay, again, this is a standard acceleration chart. In standard acceleration chart, okay, it may look very complicated. I'm going to briefly talk about how, what does each lines mean, okay, and what are the components in standard acceleration chart. Here we have 4 lines. It represents weeks. Every single tick vertical line that you can find from the chart represents week. Okay, so from the first red line to the second red line, we have 16 lines in between. So we have 16 lines in between the first tick red line and the second tick red line. So here you put in the date, okay, of the first day, okay. Most of the time we put in the Sunday, okay, here. So from the first red line to the second red line, it is 1 week time, okay. And again, every single vertical line, okay, thin line, represents 1 day. Secondly, we have the rate here. Okay, the rate here, if we only have one response per minute, then you put a cross here, okay, represent one response per minute. If you have 10 responses per minute, then we put a dot here, okay, or a symbol here, or a data point here represents we have 10 responses per minute. If the rate is 100 responses per minute, then we put a data point here, okay, at 100 responses per minute. And then the maximum, we have 1,000 responses per minute. So this is where we put our data point, represent the response rate. And then we have target, okay. We draw a line at the targets, the target of the response rate that we are aiming to achieve. So here, okay, draw a line. If your target is 50 responses per minute, you draw a line at 50 responses per minute. Why do we draw a line to indicate the target? So while and when your data points, okay, goes above 50 responses per minute, that represents the child or your student has achieved the mastery criteria, has achieved the goal. We also put a line indicate the minimum number of errors. Okay, so now we have here we have 5 responses per minute. So the minimum number of error that we want the child to have, okay, is 5. So the child shall get less than 5 errors per minute. Okay, so again, this can also be our goal. Okay, having 5 errors per minute. Most of the time, and you can see, using standard acceleration chart, we have response rate over time. So that means, okay, we have a response rate on Monday, on Tuesday, on Wednesday, okay, on each day. So when we have the target and the minimum number of error, okay, we usually use standard acceleration chart to record fluency of a performance. So fluency of a performance means how fast can a child read or per minute, or how many error does the child make, okay, while he is reading per minute. Okay, again, okay, when we are using fluency, okay, that means there is a certain duration. So how many words per minute, okay, or how many words every 10 seconds, every 15 seconds, or every hour, okay? And here you can find, okay, the duration, okay? The duration is your first unit of time, okay? So before the second unit of time, which is the day, okay? And then we have target. All the time and most of the time, you shall always draw a line, okay, and indicate the target that you are aiming. So if, for example, you are aiming to record the fluency of the child reading alphabets A and B, your first targets are of A and B. So then you draw a line here. Okay, we call that phase line. We will talk about phase line when we talk about graph. Okay, so when the child has achieved the mastery criteria, then you draw another line when you're introducing new targets, which are C and the D. So again, okay, when you have the response rate, you put in the data points, okay, which is the dot. Okay, here we have the child, okay, the child read 4 words per minute here, okay, 4 alphabets, okay, it can be either C or D, okay, so and then we put a data point on 4 per minute. And then the next day, the child has 6 words per minute. Then we put a data point, okay, on 6 responses per minute. And you can see, okay, over time, the response rate is increasing. We call that the response rate is accelerating. The child performance is accelerating. So that means, okay, if the child is, if the data represents fluency, reading fluency, so that means the child is reading faster and faster over time. So this is standard acceleration chart, okay, and that is usually used to record the child's fluency, performance fluency, okay. And again, when you are looking at the accelerations dimension of the behavior, you can use standard acceleration chart to record and evaluate whether your fluency program is effective or not, or whether your child is making progress, reading faster and faster in the particular program or not. Why do we use event recording as one of the measuring dimension? Or why do we use frequency, rate, and accelerations, okay, to measure our data? The advantages of using event recording is that event recording, okay, is really easy to use. You only have to count the number of responses. And if you're using rate, then you have to count the number of responses over a certain duration of time. If you're using acceleration, again, you have to count the number of responses over a certain period over time. And how does it change? And while we are using event recording, it has a very clear beginning and ending. So when the behavior has a very clear beginning and ending, so that means we know when does a behavior or response begin and when does a response end, okay? So while we are using event recording, you can see from the illustrations, okay, we have a very clear starting point and we have a very clear ending point. Okay, these are the advantages of using event recording. The disadvantage of using event recording is that event recording is not suitable for long duration. So again, if you have a behavior with very long durations, okay, event recording may not be the most suitable measurements or measuring dimensions, okay, for your data or for that particular behavior of interest. Okay, now after we talk about event recording, okay, the next type of measurement is duration. So under duration, we have two other types, okay, of measurements, okay, that belongs to durations, okay. The first type is duration per occurrence, and then the second one is duration per session, okay. So let's talk about duration per occurrence first. Duration per occurrence refers to the amount of time for each response. So when we are talking about count, we know that each response, okay, may last for different amount of time, okay. So here, when we talk about duration per occurrence, we are actually referring to the duration, the amount of time each response lasts. For example, Sophia leaves her chair for 5 minutes and then she comes back to the chair. So how long does Sophia leave her chair? So 5 minutes is actually the duration. Okay, here is an illustration of how does duration look like, okay, when it's being illustrated. You can see, okay, the line, okay, when it starts, okay, is when Sophia is no longer sitting on the chair. And this is when we start the timer, okay. And the second line here, okay, indicates when the behavior ends, okay. So when Sophia is no longer sitting on the chair, we start the timer, okay, which is here. And then when Sophia sits back, okay, onto her chair, okay, this is the second line to indicate that Now, Sophia is no longer living, and that's the time that Sophia has came back to the chair. So leaving the chair duration, okay, is one occurrence, okay, and this occurrence lasts for 5 minutes. The second types of measurement that we can use to record the amount of time of responses is duration per session. Duration per session refers to the total amount of time an individual engages in the target behavior. So we are no longer looking at the amount of time of a response. We are indeed looking at the total amount of time, okay, when the person is actually engaging in the target behavior. So a response is an occurrence of a behavior, and behavior is while we are and all responses, okay, you add up all responses, okay, it becomes a behavior. So again, response is an occurrence of behavior. Now I'm going to use back the same example that I used for duration per occurrence. Again, Sophia leaves her chair for a total of 25 minutes during an hour session. So it is no longer just per occurrence, okay? Probably Sophia leaves her chair for a few times, okay? And then we add up all the times together, okay? And it becomes total of duration per session or per class. Now I prepare another illustration to represent duration per session. And you can see from here, we have response 1, response 2, response 3, and response 4. Again, each response lasts for an amount of time, a certain amount of time. Okay, and we can see response 2 lasts for a longer duration compared to response 1, 3, and 4. Okay, and you can see from here, response 3, okay, is the shortest. It does not last for a long time. Now, if we are looking at duration per occurrence, we are actually looking at each response. But when we are looking at and recording duration per session, we add all duration, the amount of time or the duration of all occurrences of behavior. Okay, probably the first one is 7 minutes, the second response is 10 minutes, and then we have 2 minutes, and then we have 6 minutes. We add all the duration together during that session, okay, then we have duration per session. So this is the difference between duration per occurrence and duration per session. Duration per occurrence means the duration, okay, of a response, okay. And then we have duration per session. Duration per session refers to when we add up all the amount of time of each response, okay, then we have during a particular session, then we have duration per session. How do we record duration per occurrence or duration per sessions? We can actually do it with stopwatch, wall clocks, as well as computer system. These are the devices that we use to record duration per occurrence or duration per sessions. The advantage of using duration as the measuring dimension includes duration is suitable for responses that occur for a long period of time. If you have a behavior that actually lasts for a very long period of time, then you may consider using duration, either duration per occurrence or duration per session, to record that behavior. The disadvantage of using duration is that it is inappropriate for response that occurs frequently, that is at a very high frequency. If you have a behavior that occurs very frequently, such as hand flapping behaviors, okay, each response actually occurs for a very short period of time, but it occurs very quickly and also frequently at a very high frequency. If that is the case, then duration may not be the most suitable measuring dimension, okay, or measurement for that particular behavior. Okay, after duration, we have response latency. Response latency is also using time as the measuring dimension. However, it's different from duration. Response latency actually refers to the amount of time between stimulus and response. When we were talking about count and frequency, okay, we talk about the presentation of a stimulus and the occurrence of response. Now, this is response latency. It refers to the time. Once the stimulus has been presented and once the response occurs. For example, the time between the end of teacher's questions to students' answer. This is the latency between the teacher's questions, when the teachers ask the questions, once the questions end, and then the occurrence and the beginning of the student answers. The amount of time between these two events, okay, we call that as response latency. So again, I've prepared an illustration to show you what is response latency. We have a response here, okay, and S indicates stimulus. So once the stimulus has been presented, the time in between the stimulus, okay, and the occurrence of behavior, the beginning of the behavior, we call that latency. So we use latency to represent, okay, how fast does a response occur once a stimulus has been presented. And then here we have inter-response time. Inter-response times also involve time as part of its measuring dimension. Okay, inter-response time refers to the amount of time between two responses. Okay, and we have the word here consecutive. That means they have to happen continuously. So one response, immediately the response after this response, okay, the amount of time between these two responses, we call that inter-response time. The short form for inter-response time is IRT. So for example, the time between the first bite and the second bite. When you're eating, okay, you bite the food for the first time, and then following the first bite, you bite the food for the second time. The duration or the time, the amount of time between the first and the second bite, we call that inter-response time. This is an illustration of inter-response time. And you can see we have two responses here. We have response 1, we have response 2. So this is the first bite and this is the second bite. The time, the amount of time between these two bites, between these two responses, we call that inter-response. So inter-response, two responses, okay, inter-response time, the IRT. So now, if we have a shorter inter-response time, that also means we have higher response rate and vice versa. So that means if we have shorter IRT, we are likely to have higher response rate. But if we have a longer IRT, that means we are likely to have lower response rate. What does it mean? So imagine, okay, from the beginning of the line, the horizontal line, okay, until the end of the horizontal line, okay, it is 30 minutes. During these 30 minutes, we have two responses, response 1 and response 2. And then this is the inter-response time. So again, when we look at the response rate, during these 30 minutes, we have two responses. So we have 2 bytes during 30 minutes. And then if we have the same duration, it is still 30 minutes, but because we have shorter inter-response time, okay, and you can see the inter-response time is shorter here compared to the above inter-response time, okay? So we have shorter inter-response time, shorter inter-response time, okay? Now, if we have shorter inter-response time during the same amount of duration, which is 30 minutes, that means we have more responses compared to the first illustration. During the second illustration, we have 3 responses, and you can see the duration of each response is the same. However, because the inter-response time is shorter, we have more responses. So in the bottom illustration, we have 3 responses during 30 minutes. 3 responses during 30 minutes is a higher response rate because more number of responses occur during the same amount of time. So shorter response time, when we have shorter response time, it is likely that we have a higher response rate. So we have talked about all continuous measurements that include frequency or count, okay, and we have talked about rate, acceleration, duration, latency, inter-response time, which is IRT. Continuous measurement, again, it measures the dimensional quantity of a behavior of interest. And now let's talk about discontinuous or indirect measurement. When we are using this continuous measurement, we are actually measuring the occurrences or non-occurrences of a behavior of interest. That means we are only recording whether the behavior is occurring or it is not occurring. The discontinuous measurements, okay, include percentage, time sampling, trials to criterion, and planned activity check. Let's talk about the first discontinuous measurement, percentage. Percentage refers to the proportional quantity of the number of responses per 100 opportunities. So what does it mean? So during the 100 opportunities, how many times did the response occur? So we are only recording how many times did the response occur during that 100 trials, during that 100 opportunities. Percentage can be calculated in 2 forms. If you are calculating the count, the number of responses, then you can use the number of responses divided by the opportunities times 100%. So if we have 3 responses over 5 opportunities or 5 trials, that during that 3 responses, that means behavior occurs for 3 times. However, there are 5 trials, there are 5 opportunities that the behavior can occur, but the behavior only occurs for 3 times. So 3 divided by 5 times 100 is 60. So that means imagine if you have 100 opportunities, how many times will the behavior occur? The behavior is likely to occur for 60 times if you have 100 opportunities. This is how we calculate the percentage in terms of count, in terms of frequency. If you want to look at the amount of time, then it can be either duration divided by duration or latency divided by latency times 100%. So we record the duration of the occurrence of behavior, and we divide that with the duration of the session. Then we times 100%, then we get the percentage of the occurrence of behavior, the behavior of interest during that 100 opportunities. I'm going to give you an example. Here we have 10 trials, and you can see from this data, during the first trial, we have a plus here. A plus indicate a correct response or occurrence of response. Okay, so if we have one occurrence, during second trial, we do not have any occurrence. We have, during the third trial, we do not have any occurrence of behavior. And then during the fourth trial, we have occurrence of behavior, the behavior occurs, okay, and then so on. So we can see from here, we have 1 plus, 2 plus, 3, 4, and 5 pluses. Okay, so if you are aiming to calculate the number of time when the correct response occur, and we want to see the percentage, how many percent does the correct response occur during that session, okay, then we have to use 5 divided by 10 because we have 10 trials, okay, 10 is the total number of trials that we have here, okay. We use 5 divided by 10 times 100%, then we have 50%. So in this example, Andrew was able to label. There is a typo here without the S. Okay, so Andrew was able to label 50% of the animal flashcards that were presented during the session. So here, if we use percentage to indicate, to represent the data, okay, that means we have 50%. Andrew is able to attribute the correct response for 50% of the time when the flashcards were presented. And then we have trials to criterion. Trials to criterion is also another type of discontinuous measurement. So in trials to criterion, it refers to the number of responses to achieve a predetermined level of response. So that means how many trials do we need, or does the student need to achieve the mastery criteria or the predetermined goal of the set response. For example, if the criteria is 3 consecutive correct trials, if the mastery criteria is 3 consecutive correct responses, okay, so how many trials to criterion based on this data? So we need to count how many trials does the student need to achieve 3 consecutive correct responses. Again, the key point here, the key word here is consecutive. So that means the correct responses have to occur continuously for 3 times. You can see on the left-hand side, we have the data. The first trial is a plus, so we have a correct response, okay, for the first trial. This is number 1. Then during the second trial, we have another plus. That means we have the second correct response. So we have 2 consecutive correct responses for trial 1 and trial 2. However, if you look at trial 3, we have a minus. So that means we do not have a correct response during trial 3. Now, we have 2 consecutive responses, but trial 3 is not a correct response. So we have to start all over again. Trial 4 is a correct response. Then we have to start recalculating that now we have the first correct response. However, The fifth trial is an incorrect response. So again, when we are counting the next correct response, we have to restart. And for the sixth is a correct response. For the seventh is an incorrect response. For the eighth, we restart the count again and we have one correct response. During the ninth trial, we have another correct response. This is the second consecutive correct response. Then number 10, we have another correct response. So now if you look at 8, 9, and 10, we have 3 consecutive correct responses, 3 consecutive correct trials. This is our mastery criteria. So now, how many trials does the child need to achieve the predetermined level of performance, which is the 3 consecutive correct responses? The child requires 10 trials to achieve the criteria. So the trials to criterion based on this data is 10 trials. Now we have the first assignment for Module 8 Part 2, trials to criterion. And based on the given data, you have to see how many trials to criterion based on this data. If, for example, the criteria is 80% and above of opportunities for 3 consecutive correct trials, okay? How many trials does the student need to reach the predetermined level of performance, which is 3 consecutive trials with 80% and above? So how many trials does the child needs? And here we can see there are 18 data provided, okay? So there are 18 data here. But then you have to look at how many trials does the child need, okay, to achieve 3 consecutive 80% and above. Write down the answer and we will discuss that during group discussion. All right, and then here we have time sampling. Time sampling can be quite difficult for most of the behavior technicians or behavior therapists, but it's a very useful discontinuous measurement, especially when the behavior is really difficult to identify, or if the data is really difficult to collect. Let's talk about time sampling. There are 3 types of time sampling. The first one is whole interval, and then we have partial interval, and then we have momentary. Time sampling methods, okay, is actually used to record behavior only during intervals or at a specific moments in time. So we are using time sampling to record whether the behavior occurs or not during a specific interval or at a specific moment in time. So the observation period, okay, when we are using time sampling, the period is divided into intervals. For example, 15 seconds each interval, 15 seconds per interval. And then during these 15 seconds, during this interval, we record whether the behavior occurs or whether it did not occur. And you can see from this data sheet, okay, in each box, which is each interval, we have 15 seconds. So each box represents one interval, and during that particular interval, we have 15 seconds. So this is only an example. How long is the interval? Each interval does not have to be 15 seconds, and instead, it can be 5 seconds, it can be 10 seconds, or it can be 1 minute. Again, how do you determine how long should an interval be? It goes back to the definition of your behavior. So the way how you define your target behavior or your behavior of interest that will determine your measuring dimension, your type of measurements, and how long should it last for each interval when you are recording the data. And here we have whole interval time sampling, which is the first type of time sampling. During whole interval of time sampling, again, it is the same. The observation period is divided into intervals. So if you're observing the child and you're recording the data for a particular behavior, okay, for 20 minutes, then you have to divide that 20 minutes into intervals. It can be 10 seconds for each interval. It can also be 1 minute for each interval. Okay, again, it goes back to what behaviors, okay, do you intend to collect? So at the end of the interval, okay, if you are using whole interval time sampling, you record whether the behavior occurs throughout the interval or not, okay? So at the end of the interval, only then you record if the behavior occurs throughout the whole interval. Again, here you can see number 1 to number 69. So number 1 means the first second, and 2 is the second second, the 3 is the third second, okay? And then we have 69 seconds here. During these 69 seconds, I assume this is my observation period. During these observation periods, I divide them into intervals, and I intend to divide the interval, and each interval is 15 seconds. So I divide these observation periods into intervals, and each interval lasts for 15 seconds. Then I create a data sheet with boxes with 15 seconds in each box, in each interval. So now, if I am using whole interval time sampling, I have to see whether the behavior occurs throughout the whole intervals. For the whole 15 seconds, I am only collecting the data if the behavior occurs for the whole 15 seconds. Here, if you look at the first interval, yes, okay, the behavior occurs for the whole 15 seconds. I'm going to take a step back to explain what does the red color mean. The red color means the occurrence of the behavior of interest. Okay, for example, if you can see the first second, this is when the behavior occurs. And the behavior lasts until the 15 seconds. So that means during this response, okay, the duration of the first response is 15 seconds. Then we have another response here. This response begins at the 20th second and it lasts until the 46th second. So again, this is our second response. Then we have our third response. It begins at the 51 second and then it ends 10 seconds later. Lastly, we have our fourth response. Despite of the responses still, okay, we divide the whole observation period into 15 seconds each. We are not looking at the response. We are actually dividing the observation period into a predetermined interval. So if you want to break it down into 15 seconds, so we break the whole observation period down into 15 seconds for each interval. Now, for our first interval, as mentioned earlier, okay, the behavior lasts for the whole duration, the whole interval. Okay, then we circle the first data. If you look at the second interval, did the behavior occur for the whole second interval? No, and you can see here, there is no behavior here from the 16th second to the 20th second. During these 4 seconds, we do not have any behaviors. So that means the behavior did not last for the whole 15 seconds for the second interval. We do not circle the data, we do not collect the data because we only collect the data when the behavior occurs. Now we have the third interval. Did the behavior occur throughout the whole interval? Okay, for the 15 seconds, yes. Okay, if that is the case, then we circle the data. So again, for whole interval time sampling, we only circle and collect the data when the behavior occurred throughout the interval. You have to observe, okay, if the behavior occur, okay, in the beginning, you have to observe the whole interval to see, to identify, and to determine whether the behavior occurs throughout the whole time during that particular interval. However, okay, if the behavior did not occur when the interval begins, then you can stop observing the data until the next interval, until the beginning of the next interval. After we have recorded the data, okay, using whole interval time sampling, okay, it may look like this, okay. So, and here you can see the maximum is 10 minutes. So the observation period is 10 minutes and each interval is 15 seconds. Okay, we have to see and we have to calculate how many interval, okay, during how many interval did the behavior occur throughout the whole time. So we have here 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15, and 16. So during these 16 intervals, the behavior actually occurred during the whole time. Okay, in total, we have 40 intervals. Okay, so while we are reporting the data for whole interval time sampling, we are actually using percentage. We use 16, which is the time, the interval when the behavior occurred throughout the whole interval. Divide by 40. 40 is the total number of intervals during the observation periods. And then we use the result times 100, we have 40%. How do we report the data for whole interval time sampling? Then here we have to say, we can say that behavior occurs during 40% of the time during the observation period. If we are using whole interval, one of the disadvantages of whole interval time sampling measuring method is that it underestimates the occurrences of behavior. You can see from the previous illustration, we divide the whole observation period into intervals, and each interval it lasts for 15 seconds. And we only record the data when the behavior occurs throughout the whole interval. So we record the data during the first interval as well as the third interval. However, if you look at the second interval, the behavior did occur, but we are not recording the data for the second interval, the fourth, and the fifth, because the behavior did not occur throughout for the whole interval. So now, what about the behavior during the second interval? We are not recording the data, okay, even if the behavior actually occurred partly during the second interval, as well as the fourth and the fifth. These data are not recorded. We are only recording data when the behaviors occur throughout the whole interval. So now we are actually underestimating the occurrences of the behavior if we are using whole interval time sampling to record the data. Okay, so after the whole interval time sampling, we have partial interval time sampling here. It's pretty much the same as whole interval, okay? But in partial interval time sampling, at the end of the interval, we actually record if behavior occurs at any time during the interval. Okay, the key words here for partial interval time sampling is that we are actually recording the data if the behavior occurs at any time during the interval. So at any time, it is not throughout the interval. It does not have to occur during the whole interval, but instead, as long as the behavior occurs during any time, okay, during the whole interval, then we record the data. So we may have multiple occurrences of behavior during one interval, and still we are still recording that as and score it as one, okay, one interval, one occurrence, okay. So, and now I have also prepared the illustrations, okay, to explain partial interval time sampling. Okay, we have 1 to 69 is 1, the first second to the 69th second, okay. And that during this observation period, it is the same thing as whole interval time sampling. We divide and separate them into interval by interval, okay? And here I have 15 intervals, 15 seconds per interval, okay? So I put 15 seconds, okay, in one interval, okay? And during the whole observation periods, okay, I separate them, the whole period into each interval, and each interval lasts for 15 seconds, okay? Then I have the data sheet here. It's the same thing, okay? It's a table, okay, with 15 seconds in each box. And now, while we are using partial interval time sampling, we record the data as long as the behavior occurs at any time during the interval. And you can see during our first interval, did the behavior occur during the first interval? Yes. Okay, then we take, okay, and we circle the data. Look at our second interval. Did the behavior occur during the second interval? Again, we do not need the behavior to occur throughout the whole interval. We only need the behavior to occur at any time for any number of occurrences during one interval. Then we score and record the data. During the second interval, again, it's a yes. Then we record the data. During the third interval, do we have any behaviors? No, we do not have any behavior during the third interval, so we leave it empty. During the fourth interval, yes. Now, even though the behavior occur for the whole and throughout the whole interval, we are still recording that as one. So we record that data and we circle it on the data sheet. During the fifth, the last interval, okay, yes, we have behavior during the interval, then we record the data. So as long as behavior occurs during the interval, we record the data. It's the same thing as whole interval. We report the data using percentage. So it's the same thing if we have 60 out of 40 intervals, okay, that the behavior occurs, okay, it is 40%. Okay, now those that are not recorded, those empty data, okay, empty boxes, okay, it indicates that no behavior has occurred at all during that interval. So now, if you are using partial interval time sampling, the advantage of this method is that we can actually record multiple behaviors simultaneously, because once we have observed the occurrence of the behavior, okay, we observe the first occurrence of the behavior during the interval, then we will just collect the data. And if there is no behavior, then we have to continue to observe whether the behavior occurs or not, okay, during the interval. So if you're recording multiple behaviors, okay, we can actually divide our attention and observe multiple behaviors simultaneously. However, the disadvantage of this partial interval time sampling is that this method overestimates the occurrences of behavior. So again, we can see from the illustration, we collect data whenever there is occurrences of behavior during the interval. So even if, okay, and if you can see, okay, during the first, second, and the last interval, and during some times we do not have behavior, but still we record the data. So using this method, okay, to record and collect data, okay, we may overestimate the occurrences of the behavior, which is also one of the disadvantages of partial interval time sampling. After we talk about the first two types of time sampling, we have talked about whole interval time sampling, we have talked about partial interval time sampling, and then the last types of time sampling is momentary time sampling. For momentary time sampling, at the end of the interval, we record if the behavior occurs at the end of the interval when the timer rings, or okay, at a specific time. So if let's say, again, this is an illustrations, okay, of the behavior. And at the specific time, the predetermined movement, we draw a line. Okay, we set a timer. If the predetermined time is every 15 seconds, then we draw a line at the 15 seconds, and then the 30th, the 45th, and 1 minute. During this time, okay, we have to record if the behaviors actually occur only during this time. Okay, so let's have a look. During the first one, okay, and again, during the first second, okay, did the behavior occur? And you can see, look at this, okay, the rate is the occurrences of behavior. And yes, the behavior occurred during the first time, okay, the first predetermined moment. We take and we collect the data. And if you could see the second and the third, do we have any occurrences of behavior during the second and the third predetermined moment? No, we do not have any behaviors during these two moments, okay, which is at the 30th and at the 45th. So we do not record any data. During the fourth one, do we have any occurrences of behavior? It is a yes, then we record the data. While we are using momentary time sampling, we report the data like whole interval when we are using whole interval and partial interval time sampling. Again, if you could see from here, if we have 11 data, okay, collected, then we use that 11 trials, okay, intervals divided by the total number of intervals times 100. Then we have 27.5%. So that means we can report the data as the behavior occur for about 27.5, sorry, it's not 25.5, it's 27.5% of the observation time. The advantage of momentary time sampling includes it does not require undivided attention. So during other times, you can do other things. You're only observing the behavior when the timer rings at a predetermined moment, okay? So you do not need to pay attention to record the behavior, but you only need to record the behavior and observe the behavior when the timer rings at a predetermined time. Another advantage of using momentary time sampling is that, okay, you can always use it when continuous observation is not allowed because it is very easy to record and to implement. So you can use momentary time sampling when continuous observation is not allowed. And then a disadvantage of the momentary time sampling is it underestimates the occurrence of behavior. Again, if you could see from the illustration, we record the behavior during first and the last moment, okay? What about during other time, okay? Even when the behavior is occurring, we are not recording that behavior. So we are likely and we may underestimate the occurrence of behavior. Another disadvantage of momentary time sampling is that for low frequency or for short duration behavior, or behavior that occurs for a short duration, we may not be able to use momentary time sampling. So these are the advantages and disadvantages of momentary time sampling. Again, among these three types of time samplings, momentary time sampling is still the easiest to use and the most convenient to use because it does not require undivided attention. And you can do other things, provide other activity during other time while we are collecting the data of the behavior using momentary time sampling. And lastly, we have planned activity check, which is also a type of discontinuous measurement. We usually use planned activity check when we want to measure the behavior of a group of individuals. For example, if you want to record the number of students whose head lie on table when timer rings, which is, let's say, at the end of the interval or at a predetermined moment. Okay, so we want to record the number of students. Then during the whole time, okay, during the whole observation periods, okay, again, we have 69 seconds here. Okay, we draw like momentary time sampling. We draw a line at the predetermined moment and we count how many students actually have their head lay on table during that predetermined moment. Okay, again, okay, this can be our data. So during the 15th second, we have 4 students laying their head on the table. Okay, then we have on the 30th second, we have 5 students laying their head on the table, and then so on. So now if this is our data, it's the same thing as time sampling. We use percentage to report the data. So during the first interval, we have 4 students. So we use 4, and then there are 10 students in the class. We use 4 divided by 10 times 100, that means 40%. So how do we report the data for planned activity check? We say there are 40% of students laying their head on the table during the 15 seconds of time. We have 50% of students laying their head on table at the 30th second of our observation duration, observation period. The advantage of using planned activity check includes we can record the behavior of a group of consumers, of a group of individuals, okay? We don't have to use that one-to-one. However, the disadvantage of using planned activity check is that we are likely to have errors compared to the actual target behaviors. So we are likely to make errors when we are using planned activity check, okay, when we are compared to when we are recording the target behaviors, okay, using other measurements. So we may not be able to see and record, or we are likely to make errors while we are recording the target behavior. The last type of measurements that we want to include in Module 8, Part 2 is permanent products. So permanent product is, we collect the data, okay? And while we are collecting the data of the behavior, we have to know that all behaviors, some behaviors produce consistent effects, or they produce products on the environment. While we are using permanent product as the measurements to record the behavior, we are actually looking at the effects of the behavior on the environment, or we are looking at the products of the behavior on the environment. We measure the effects or the products, okay, on the environment, okay, after it has occurred. If we are measuring this effect, we call that permanent product. If you are using permanent product as our measurement, okay, we can use it for behaviors such as writing. So, and this is some words and some sentences, okay, of a child writing an essay about the beach. This is the products of the writing behavior. If you are using this as our measurement, so we are collecting these, okay, as the permanent products of the writing behavior. Again, drawing behavior, baking behavior, or sewing behavior. We can also look at the products of these behaviors. And if we are measuring the effect or the products of this behavior, we are indeed using permanent products as our measurement. We use permanent product when real-time measurement, okay, which is observing and recording response of interest as they occur, okay, is not possible. If we cannot measure the real-time behavior, so when the behavior is occurring, we cannot measure the behavior, the occurrence of behavior, then we may have to use the effect of the behaviors as the measurement. Again, we use permanent product when ongoing data is actually very difficult. For behavior that produces products and effect or have certain effect on the environment, we can also use permanent product as the measurement for that behavior. The limitation, okay, of using permanent products as measurement is that if real-time measurement is needed, then we may not have the data when the behavior is occurring. So we may lose information if we use permanent product to record the data. So there are advantages and disadvantages of using permanent product as measurement, okay? And you may have to select, okay, the most suitable based on the selected target behavior. The last type of measurements that we want to include in Module 8, Part 2 is permanent products. So permanent product is, we collect the data, okay? And while we are collecting the data of the behavior, we have to know that all behaviors, some behaviors produce consistent effects, or they produce products on the environment. While we are using permanent product as the measurements to record the behavior, we are actually looking at the effects of the behavior on the environment, or we are looking at the products of the behavior on the environment. We measure the effects or the products, okay, on the environment, okay, after it has occurred. If we are measuring this effect, we call that permanent product. If you are using permanent product as our measurement, okay, we can use it for behaviors such as writing. So, and this is some words and some sentences, okay, of a child writing an essay about the beach. This is the products of the writing behavior. If you are using this as our measurement, so we are collecting these, okay, as the permanent products of the writing behavior. Again, drawing behavior, baking behavior, or solving behavior. We can also look at the products of these behaviors. And if we are measuring the effect or the products of this behavior, we are indeed using permanent products as our measurement. We use permanent product when real-time measurement, okay, which is observing and recording response of interest as they occur, okay, is not possible. If we cannot measure the real-time behavior, so when the behavior is occurring, we cannot measure the behavior, the occurrence of behavior, then we may have to use the effect of the behaviors as the measurement. Again, we use permanent product when ongoing data is actually very difficult. For behavior that produces products and effect or have certain effect on the environment, we can also use permanent product as the measurement for that behavior. The limitation, okay, of using permanent products as measurement is that if real-time measurement is needed, then we may not have the data when the behavior is occurring. So we may lose information if we use permanent product to record the data. So there are advantages and disadvantages of using permanent product as measurement. Okay, and you may have to select, okay, the most suitable based on the selected target behavior. And now we have the second assignment for our module 8, part 2, data collections. Now I have some instructions for you, okay, for your assignment. You select a target behavior, you define the target behavior of probably of your student, of your child, of any individual that you know. Then based on this definition and based on the target behavior that you have defined, you select the most appropriate measuring dimension, and then you select the most suitable measurements that you have learned in this module. You record a video of the target behavior, and then you use the measurement that you have selected to collect the data of the behavior. Okay, so you can record a short video. It can be a 5 minutes video. It can be a 10 minutes video. Based on the video and based on the measurement that you have selected that you think is the most suitable measurement to record that particular target behavior. Okay, and then you use that measurement to record the data of the target behaviors, and then during the group supervision, kindly show us the video that you have recorded and kindly show us the data that you have collected using the selected measurement.